Well, hello everyone. We are looking to start right on time this evening. My greetings to you all. It has been several weeks since we have begun this, and boy, I'm excited to be back. I've been able to work through a bunch of these things and prepare a really interesting one for this evening when we are dealing with issues of the Eastern Church and issues that pertain to aspects of the branches of the church that maybe we're not as familiar with. I think it's really helpful sometimes to just kind of sit back and go over it. And if you can tell from the title, we're dealing with an incredible amount of time, and so we're not going to be, delving hugely specific into all these various things. But I do find in the Western Church after the Great Schism of 1054, our attention towards the Eastern Orthodox brothers and sisters of ours languishes. We actually, for most of us, if we go through a church history course, won't ever even discuss the issue of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And so I wanted to take some time here after we have gone through the European Reformations and address the issues of the Eastern Orthodox Church. There's a lot of things that go on there. There's a whole lot of stuff that we are not going to cover. I want to express that, but some of these things I'm just going to mention as we pass by. Ken, you say welcome back, Tim. Thank you very much, Ken. I appreciate it. It's good to be back. I did post a short announcement video and episode to the podcast, kind of explaining what transpired the last 6 weeks, 7 weeks as I've been gone. As it is now, unless some otherworldly thing happens, I'm here every week for the foreseeable future, and we're not stopping for the summer. By the way, I had a couple of questions about that too. So, nope, we're going to continue straight through. I love teaching this stuff. I don't want to take another summer off, so I'm going straight through with this. So, tonight we're going to talk about the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now, when I say Eastern Orthodox Church, a lot of people, at least in areas in the kind of the world that I grew up in, Protestant, Independent Baptist or Independent Presbyterian, or even just broadly evangelical, even the seminary I went to, which was Wesleyan. There really was not a huge dealings with the Eastern Church. The Eastern Church was kind of just one of those things that's, way out there. We don't really have to worry about that. It would almost be forgivable for some of us not to have any interactions with it. That's going to change in church history. This is one of those things that I talk about with regards to the direction and the way in which church history is headed. We're able to converse with different branches of the church that we've never really been able to converse with before. And we're able to do that through the internet. We're able to do that. I've discussed things with people that live on the other side of the world with regards to, how the Nicene Creed is recited, for instance, something that's going to come up this evening. That all that kind of stuff really drives home the reality that the next century of the church is going to be one of trying to figure out how to talk to one another. And so understanding each other's history is going to be very, very important going forward. And so this is kind of one of those places that we take a step back in church history, and we want to see a side of the church that maybe we don't really address very often, at least here in the West. And I would hope that my brothers or sisters in the Eastern Orthodox Church who are listening, because I know I have several that do. If I get things wrong, I want just a bit of grace on that, because this is something that I will say is a lot of my own putting together through books I've read. And the church history classes I've ever taken haven't covered this at all, which is really unfortunate because it's a remarkable history, and the attempts and the desires back and forth, the frustrations, kind of the struggles between church and culture and how those work together is something that is a side of church history that I had to go and seek out and learn for myself. And so every time I teach through church history, I want to go a little bit deeper, a little bit broader, a little bit more on places that tend to get overlooked. This is one of those. So, for those of you who are new, those of you who aren't around much with regards to church history and just kind of either fell into this class and are wondering what in the world's going on, there's three main sections of the Christian church today, at least broadly speaking. Now, obviously, this is extremely broad brushstrokes we're painting with here. There's the Roman Catholic Church, which is centered around the papacy and the Holy See there in Rome. Then there's also the Protestant world. As far as for sizes are concerned, I'm speaking to them. The two biggest ones are the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant world. Now, the Protestant Church obviously is not held together by any specific one thing. If there is any one thing, it's that we put Scripture above tradition, and that would go across the board. Even in the most liberal denominations, you would still have Scripture a little tiny bit above tradition. And so that's probably about the only one thing that holds all the Protestant world together. The Protestant world is a huge patchwork of things that we'll get into. And then the third side of that is the Eastern Orthodox Church. The Eastern Orthodox Church, for the longest time, was centered in Constantinople, and not just centered in Constantinople, because that kind of puts a way of thinking about the church that's not consistent with the Eastern Orthodox world. So let me put it in terms that they would. One of their um, one of their heads of the church would be in Constantinople. Historically speaking, there was four others, at least in Eastern thinking. There's four others. There would be Rome, there would be Constantinople, as mentioned, and then the other three would be Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria, Egypt. And those five centers of Christianity for the first 1,000 years would have been considered the collegial patriarchs of the church on some level or another. They would be the bishops that work together to kind of manage everything with regards to the church universal. Um, there's a lot of things that and issues and linguistic and cultural distinctions that really started driving two sides of it from each other, from the East and the West. And in the West, you just had Rome, and those who would answer to Rome. And that would include sometimes at different points parts of North Africa and much of what we know as Western Europe. But Constantinople, when it was founded in the 4th century, and Antioch, which would have been one of the most ancient centers of Christianity, Jerusalem, which it was the most ancient center of Christianity, and Alexandria, Egypt, which would be the center of Christian learning, Christian philosophy, and study. These five heads of the church, the bishops of these cities, would be seen as the five collegiate heads of the church. Now, for the first millennia of the church, a lot of people argued, and East and West would argue, that Rome had a special, unique relationship. It wasn't that it was primary, it was that it was the most revered among the five. That is due to a number of cultural artifacts from history that we have discussed many times before. But as time wore on, obviously with the founding of Constantinople in the 300s by Constantine, that center of Christianity and the moving of the head of the Roman Empire to Constantinople and moving away from Rome did things culturally to the church. And some of the things that it did to the church was to move in some people's minds the center of where the church was to be focused. And so you would have people that would hold to old Rome, and then you would have people that would hold to what people were calling the second Rome or the new Rome, which was Constantinople, placed strategically on this remarkable mixture of where the Mediterranean and the Black Sea meet together. Really cool stuff. Constantinople was just a very, very well designed city and had a lot of cultural aspects to that are just fascinating for a history buff. But for church history, it's fascinating because it actually shifted in a lot of people's minds where the center of the church was. For a long time, due to the significance of the empire in Rome, the center of the church would have been considered all throughout but Rome would have held some level of not primacy, not that early on. Rome would have had some kind of first honor, if you will. It's not like Rome was in charge. That kind of concept doesn't come till later on in the first millennia. But as we move through, there's so many different aspects that happen. One is that on the eastern side of all of this, and with Constantinople, everything is Greek speaking. On the western side, everything is Latin speaking. And we talked a lot about this effect that was on the church after the governance of the Roman Empire moved to Constantinople. Rome was left on its own, and as far as the church was concerned, they saw themselves as the caretaker of what was Rome. And so in the Western world, you talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, and then you go to the, late 4th, early 5th century. Well, that's the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. The Eastern Roman Empire continued on for another 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire, and the capital truly moved from Rome to Constantinople. So in the East, they do not see that there is an issue with the Roman Empire continuing. This was a continuance of this. And so they had emperors, Roman emperors. They would consider themselves Romans. They would refer to themselves as Romans. They would see themselves as the continuers of this. And so that continues, but then the church in Rome has a different kind of spiel about this. And there's a difference of opinion culturally, linguistically, semantically. And then you start to have issues with different desires in theology, different developments in theology. One of the most significant being that the Nicene Constantinople Creed had a, well, in English it's a phrase, in Greek it's a singular word, the filioque clause. And it's this, to most modern ears, this almost inconsequential three word section of the Nicene Creed that expressed that the Holy Spirit didn't just proceed from the Father, but also proceeded from the Son. In the West, they made this change without the approval of the East. And then when the East questioned them on changing the creed, what authority did you do this with? They answered, well, ours. We have this authority. And the struggle of authority, the questions of authority, continued to go back and forth. And there was continual breakdown as the West was developing new doctrines, things like purgatory, things like indulgences, transubstantiation, and the issues of the primacy of Rome. And as a number of these things continue to develop, the Eastern Church was just growing further and further away. And so one time it's Rome's fault, another time it's the Eastern Orthodox side of the church fault. For the first millennia, really, you refer to them as the Latin Church and the Greek Church, and those two sides of it grow apart for many, many different reasons. And by the time, and so I really want to lay that groundwork before we talk about our first main point, which is the Great Schism of 1054. The Great Schism of 1054, on the day that it happened over leavened and unleavened bread. And so you look at that and you just go like, what? That didn't make any sense. That is the straw that broke the camel's back. It's the one piece of unleavened bread that was able to snap in half this entire cascade effect that it had in separating the two sides of the church from east and west. And so before I even talk about that, I have to always lay down this kind of history beforehand and say the issues between East and West, the issues between the Greek church and the Latin church for for 500 years had just been simmering and working and growing and having problems. Even their communication was breaking down because, again, linguistically, Latin and Greek are not that close, and it's kind of hard to have very detailed descriptions of the way that the Trinity interacts inside the Godhead, or the way in which that the personhood of the Christ, what kind of union was taking place between his divine and his human nature. Like, those kind of conversations are hard enough in the same language. To deal with them in two different languages becomes enormously problematic. The Great Schism of 1054, as I mentioned, was it was not primarily over leavened and unleavened bread. That was just the issue of the moment, and the issue of the moment really came down to a difference of culture. Culturally, in the East, they used leavened bread for the Eucharist meal. Well, in the West, they use unleavened bread. Now you look at that and you go like, well, who really cares? Well, they did. And it was an important issue, especially in the East, actually. In the East, to use unleavened bread was to actually align more so with the Jews with regards to their traditions of Passover than it was to align with Christ. And so we may hear that in the West and just go, that's nonsense. It's just unleavened bread. Yeah, but it carries with it a lot of cultural heritage and cultural baggage. It would be similar to someone, kind of dropping in, to America, and that's not an American, and having no respect for, oh, I don't know, some of the customs we have in church, not standing up at the right time, or getting up and going to the bathroom during a sermon, or something that would be like culturally issuous to us, but maybe not so to them. This grew to much higher problems, especially since it involved the liturgy of the church. Um, the issue truly happened in the most prominent church in the East, and that is the Hagia Sophia, that is in Constantinople. It's actually still there. It's not Constantinople anymore. We'll talk about why that is. It's called Istanbul now, and it's a mosque now. And that could kind of indicative of all the things that we're about to cover. What had happened was that there was these legates sent from the Pope in Rome, one of them being Cardinal Humbert, who, being a representative from Rome, came and in the middle of all of this, and during the church service, actually during the Eucharistic meal, uh, put down a papal bull of excommunication against the Patriarch of Constantinople, that is the Bishop of Constantinople, New Rome. And he did this by placing a papal bull of excommunication on the altar there in the Hagia Sophia. This was not a just a wave of or a whiff of the temper or something like this, or a loss of temper. This was a sought out, planned out possibility for this trip. And again, multiple stories go back and forth. I don't want to even hint at taking sides in this. I think everyone was wrong in this. There was stubbornness on both sides, by I think both sides attestation pretty clearly said. Um, in fact, the response of the Eastern Church through the Patriarch of Constantinople and also a synod of bishops. Remember, a synod is just a local or a regional meeting of pastors. The Patriarch of Constantinople and a synod of bishops responded by issuing their own excommunication. Now, what's important? What they excommunicated was not the Pope. They excommunicated the papal legates, Cardinal Humbert and the people that who were traveling with him. And so what had been simmering and below the surface for 4, 5, 600 years came to this head over one foolish little issue, and then a whole bunch of childish people throwing excommunications back and forth. And that division that happened between East and West for the next, well, here we are now, 900 and what, 70, 80, or 70 years later, is still not healed. We still have the Western Church and the Eastern Church. Now, I will say from my perspective, somewhere in the next 100, 200 years, I think it is almost inevitable that there's going to be some merging between East and West on some level. And I think we're already starting to see rumblings of that, but that may be outside of our time frame yet. Um, one of the things that continued to happen was just the driving further and further culturally and further theologically from one another, from East and West. So the Great Schism, in your mind, 1054, it's one of those dates you just need to have in church history, right? Council of Nicaea, 325. These ones just got to roll off your tongue, right? Great Schism, 1054. Luther's nailing of the 95 Theses, if you're Protestant, 1517. Those types of things need to kind of just help frame where you are and what's going on. One of the one of the continuing difficulties that happened between East and West was in the East, they were constantly being bombarded by Islamic pressure. The Turkish world, the Ottoman Empire that continued to develop and become a force to be reckoned with was something that really has a lot to do with the way that Islam itself works, which is a little bit beyond the scope of this lecture, but is a fascinating study of its own. Um, a lot of the crusading spirit that came out of the 1100s and continued to spill over into the 1200s, it wasn't just in liberating the Holy Land, though that was part of it. A lot of it was just pushing back Islamic ideals and reigning and power that it had. And the Eastern Church was the one primarily asking for help with this, especially with regards to the fact that one of the central hubs of the Eastern Orthodox Church, historically speaking, was Jerusalem. And so it's far more complicated. We covered all of this back through the Crusades, but the only one I really want to focus in on is what is commonly referred to as the Fourth Crusade. Now, if you've been through the Crusades with me, you know there's no way to separate the Crusades: First Crusade, Second, Third, Fourth, Fifth. It doesn't really work like that. This it's more of like a cloud of crusading-ishness. But the Fourth Crusade is easy enough to express in terms of something bounded like that. Basically what had happened was the Eastern Church continued to ask for help in freeing the Holy Land. There was more issues that needed to be covered there that the First Crusades had not finished out, and there was a lot of remnants of things going on. The long story is and we told a lot of this during the time of the Crusades, but suffice it to say here that the Fourth Crusade got, for a lack of a better term, hangry, and ended up sacking Constantinople rather than going to Jerusalem direct. There was a lot of reasons for that, a lot of political reasons for that. They were Venetians, and they had issues with regards to what was going on with some of their lands that had been taken from them. And then the emperor that was in Constantinople was not really exactly listening to their complaints. A lot of stuff going on, stuff we're not going to get into. Fascinating history, but beyond what we're here talking about. The long short of it is that the Fourth Crusade ended up sacking Constantinople, destroying churches, altars, plundering relics. Again, this is the time where relics are starting to take off, especially in the West. They've always kind of been a thing in the East, but when they came to the West, they became a really big thing. Um, to add insult to injury, at the end and the close of the Fourth Crusade, they removed the Greek patriarch from his position in Constantinople and installed a Latin one. As you can imagine, that doesn't go over very well with the people. And this does not go over well for relations between the East and the West Church. And so the Great Schism, that was at this point 150 years old, just deepens and the cavern between them widens culturally, militarily, theologically, and even with any concept of responsibility towards one another. In fact, you really cannot overstate how significant the uh, the 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 final blows to the Byzantine Empire that the Fourth Crusade was. It started shattering what was somewhat of a cohesive empire at that point. And then after that, it became a very fractured patchwork of an empire. And the Fourth Crusade is directly responsible for a lot of that. And what continued to happen there in the coming years just drove the two sides of the church apart. And there you're talking again, the Fourth Crusade, 1204 would be the date for that if you are taking notes. From that, we zoom forward. There's a lot of things that happen, and there's some attempts at bringing the two sides of the church together. Obviously, there's a lot happening over on the Western Front that we've covered at length. But one of the things that I really want to focus in on was something called the Council of Florence. And the reason I want to focus in on this is because it gets overlooked so much. In fact, it wasn't until about 3 years ago, after I'd already been teaching church history multiple times, that I even learned of the Council of Florence. It is just not taught in the Protestant world. And that's frustrating to me because this is an interesting thing. Now, the reality is the effect of the Council of Florence is basically nothing. But the Council of Florence should be included because it shows this desire amongst so many to try to bring East and West back together again. In fact, that was the point of the Council of Florence. It wasn't even just the point of the Council of Florence. There's the Council of Lyon, numbers 1 and 2, that both had this as part of their goal. Now, all of them ended up failing with regards to bringing East and West back again, but it's really important, I've come to learn, to understand the relationship between East and West. And so this becomes, now, if you're Eastern Orthodox, you might find it crazy that I don't know about the Council of Florence. I do too, but the reality is, in my world, that's just not covered. When we get to the 1400s in the Protestant world, we're sitting here talking about, waiting around for Martin Luther to be born, right? And so we're kind of gearing up to, the most significant century as far as for our own history is concerned. And so we go pretty much from the Council of Constance in 1415 to discussions on the Renaissance and discussions on, papal primacy, that and conciliarism, and then we come to indulgences, medieval Western concepts of salvation, and then Martin Luther, right? And so we just jump over the Council of Florence, which the years, if you're taking notes, 1438 to 1445. Now, put that with asterisks all around because, and honestly, you can even put an asterisk on the word Florence in Council of Florence because it actually moved a couple of times and it met throughout all of that. But that's for what we're dealing with here. This is what I'm going to stick with. Council of Florence, 1438 to 1445. It is the most well-known attempt to reunify the East and the West. And you might be surprised to hear how far along the negotiations got, right? So let's start with some of the positive negotiations that happened at the Council of Florence. First, they were able to come and compromise on the Filioque clause. Now, you got to understand just how significant that is. First of all, I mean, the change in the West to add a word to the creed on their own authority, it should have been pretty easy to understand which direction the agreement should go. It should be Rome giving up what they did of their own authority. Well, that's not how it happened, right? The Eastern Orthodox Church basically gave up kind of like 90% of their claim. The Roman Catholic Church gave about 10%, but that was really only in just, capitulating to a description of the procession of the Holy Spirit. Regardless of such, if you're not interested in the history of the Filioque clause, no worries. Just to realize that the one that was making a lot of concession here on this point was the Eastern Orthodox Church, right? Um, on the second point, positive negotiations. Leavened and unleavened bread were determined to be acceptable for the Eucharist. They based it on your own liturgical historical practices. Now, you have got to understand how significant this is for both sides to agree with. Rome at this point is dealing with authority issues extraordinaire. Who is truly in charge? Council, papal office, whatever. Any deviance whatsoever from one of them would lead to questions of authority and questions of significance. So the idea that both came together and agreed to recognize each other's liturgical tradition is important. And they both gave what I would call 50-50 here. Now, I'm not as up on how deep of an issue that would have been for the Eastern Orthodox Church. It might have been more ground being ceded for them, but to my eyes, 50-50 looks about right on that one. With regards to purgatory, which was a Roman invention, there's really no debate about that. That was from the Roman Catholic Church, inventing that in the medieval period. Purgatory was partially agreed upon, um, basically on 2 points: one, that the dead undergo some level of purification, and two, that prayers and good works on their behalf can help them. But the details of that doctrine were not dealt with at the Council of Florence, so asterisks on that one being a positive thing. We'll come back to that. So let's go to the problematic negotiations. One was the primacy of the Pope. The primacy of the Pope was a sticking point. Now, if you've been through this church history course so far, you know that the primacy of the Pope is a sticking point inside the Western Church. Conciliarism is a huge thing, not just in the West. Conciliarism is a huge thing also in the East. In fact, more so in the East, because the East has a natural allergy to this concept that there's a single person in charge of everything that's unquestioning. And so conciliarism would be much more accepted culturally in the East than it would be in the West. And the primacy of the Pope at this point is not going to be a really good thing for the West to negotiate away, because you're dealing with all sorts of challenges to the papal office. And remember, the Council of Constance was only a generation before. That's where papal authority got a huge setback, with conciliarism kind of taking hold of everything going on there. And so this was a real sticky point for both sides. Rome was very unbending in this, and several in the East were giving in, but several weren't. And so this becomes kind of one of those problematic negotiations. The same thing happens with purgatory. While they were able to agree on some of the overarching aspects, the details of the doctrines were not dealt with, and it ended up, along with papal primacy, contributing to the failure of the council entirely. Um, as you well know, the Eastern Church and the Roman Catholic Church, the Western Church, are not unified today. Obviously, the Council of Florence did not succeed in this. The reunification fell flat. It was almost as unpopular as it was as unsuccessful. The popularity level of this council, once they finished and released one of their aspects of how this would work out, it was absolutely culturally untenable. People wouldn't have it, especially in the East. We were giving so much ground in the East to the West, was this concept that there's this is almost to the level of betraying who we are so that we can make nice with Rome. Now, if you have a timeline in your head in church history, and you go, okay, I got 1438 to 1445, and you're talking about the East and the West, and you realize something's coming in a couple of years, 1453, that will change the way the Eastern world works. And that is the fall of Constantinople. Now, I'm not one much for looking at a section or an event in history or an event in someone's life and saying what immediately preceded that earned that. But there's a lot of people that certainly do look at that this way. And the idea that the East was giving up so much of its claim, so much of its autonomy to the West, at least in the eyes of a lot of people in the East, looked at the fall of Constantinople 8 years later and said that that was a consequence of the Eastern Church's failure. Now, in reality, the fall of Constantinople was the most significant thing to happen to the Eastern Church. And it's not even close. It's even more significant than the Great Schism and separation from the Western Church. The fall of Constantinople changes everything. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was the actual end of the Roman Empire, as far as any way to actually say that there's continuance. Now, Russia will take other claims to it elsewise, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But the fall of Constantinople, if you want to say, the fall of the Western Empire, yes, that fell back in the early 400s. And then 1,000 years later, we have the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. That fall of Constantinople is so significant. The chief church, or at least we would say the first church of honor in the Eastern Orthodox Church, is the Hagia Sophia, which is converted into a mosque as the Ottoman Turks come in and take over Constantinople. The fall of Constantinople is a fascinating discussion in siege warcraft and all sorts of things. Again, bypassing that, not a history class primarily. But we do have to talk about not just the way in which it was taken over. We have to talk about who came in and took it over. Um, Islam itself is such a different beast from Christianity that it is kind of hard to overstate. Islam itself is a political, religious ideology all wrapped into one cohesive bundle. You don't have religious life and then political life in Islam. They are by design unified. Christianity in the medieval and Middle Ages and even in the early Renaissance like this is working in tandem or in parallel or in influence with one another, but there's some church over here, state over here. There's differences. In Islam, you don't have that. Islam, as a political religion, which is what I will call it, I think that's a fair assessment. When it came to eliminate the Byzantine Empire, it did not want to do away with the Eastern Church. This is really important, and I think to their credit as well. Islam would have a certain tax they would exact from Jews or from Christians and so forth, but by and large, they were not trying to eliminate them from their lands. Instead, actually, what they did use was to utilize the Eastern Orthodox Church leaders in local governmental affairs. Islam wanted to be in charge of the top rungs of governance, but then through that, run everything else. Through this, then the Eastern Orthodox Church, just as it was throughout the rest of the Eastern Orthodox world, in Antioch or in Jerusalem or in Alexandria, all of those places had lived under Islamic rule for hundreds of years at this point. A lot of that reason is why or a lot of the reason why when you walk into an Orthodox church, you feel like you're jumping back into the 7th, 8th, 9th century, is because you really kind of are. For a lot of the Orthodox Church, it did not have development of liturgy or changes of artistic style or even of building style, because it spent most of its time um, underneath the rule of another religion. And so, when that happens culturally and architecturally and even artistically and even theologically, you don't really have development or changes in the middle of something like that. And so one of the effects of this is that in the fall of Constantinople, kind of the last bastion of self-ruled Eastern Orthodoxy comes to an end. For a long while here. The fall of Constantinople, the emperor who is Emperor Constantine the 11th. I forget how many generations he is after the original Constantine. It's not 11. It's much more than that. I forget the number of it. But Constantine the 11th dies at the fall of Constantinople. The that reign, that empire comes to an end. The Byzantine Empire closes down, and now the Eastern Orthodox Church is an isolated church in an Islamic world. The only exception to that at this point in history will be the Russian branch of the Orthodox Church, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail here in a second. Um, but a lot of this continued to affect and morph the way that the Eastern Orthodox Church saw itself, its role in society, what it would call what it would call the philanthropos, this the love of man, this general relationship that the church would have towards society, and also for it to see itself as in exiled submission under Islam. Now, to a lot of people, they're looking at this and going, we tried to go and have almost an exiled submission to Rome at the Council of Florence. And then because we capitulated so much to that, people were arguing 8 years later, the fall of Constantinople, the main church and the main city of the Eastern Orthodox world all falls to be under Islamic rule. And they say this is our judgment for trying to do this. Not everyone was saying that. Not everyone believed that. Even today, there's differences on this. But the reality is that there was enough people saying that it really started to feel like punishment from God. That has a way of morphing your theology. Just like when we come to see in 19th century American evangelicalism, for instance, in the 1800s, theology in America goes insane. Why? Well, for the same reason, but for the opposite reason. Everything went so well. You could just go anywhere, scratch out a living for yourself, and everything was great. You could live off the land, you could build yourself a log cabin, everything. That affects theology. Living under another religious political system will affect theology, and it certainly did in the Eastern Orthodox Church, for some good and for some bad. One of the issues is that Christianity itself, as we have learned many, many times, does not naturally interact with the state very well. And when the church and the state come really, really close to one another, both get harmed, but the church more so. The church has more to lose and more to keep track of and more to care about than the state. The state, there's all sorts of ways to run the state. The church, we're bounded by what we can believe based on creeds, based on councils, based on scripture, right? And I'm speaking in terms that they would refer to themselves as. And so in the East, what begins happening is the same stuff that's been happening in the West. They start getting plagued by the same issues. Simony, for instance, the buying and selling of church offices, becomes a huge problem, especially when the way in which you get along in an Islamic world at that time period would be to have some level of influence in the governance or the continuing of the local government. And the only way to do that would be to have a specific church office. And in order to do that, well, there was a market for it. Such offices came with political power, and Christianity in the East starts to have more of a struggle with things that we would usually associate with the West. And again, church and state coming close to one another never really works out well for the church. Now, I've mentioned several times of the Russian Orthodox Church, and we're going to talk about something with that. What I am more and more astounded by is how little I know about the Orthodox Church. It is a treasure trove of not just information, but of just seeing a whole nother branch of the church that has worked through issues that I've never even considered. Um, and I mean, I've worked through issues that Eastern Orthodox brothers and sisters of mine haven't worked through, and that's fine. We're just separated by so much, and I think this is one of the things that I appreciate more going forward is we're going to be able to have more conversations, but they are going to be harder if we do not understand each other's history. And I think that's really why I want to include so much of this and as much of it as we can. Because changes happen all around us, and most of us don't even sit up and realize. And I toss myself in with that. Why am I going to talk about the Russian Orthodox Church? It has nothing to do with current events, nothing at all. As to why I'm talking about it, it's to say what those people who were in that church at the time were saying about themselves. And so let me introduce you to this. The Russian Orthodox Church after the fall of Constantinople. Now you have to understand, as we had discussed in the first 1,000 years of the church, you had 5 centers of the church: Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, Egypt. There was another one added a little bit later on, in fact, a whole lot later on, but it was kind of the new kid on the block as far as the world was concerned, and that a lot of this has to do with Slavic missionaries and with reaching out past kind of uh, the borders of the empire into the east, and that is the founding of the Russian Orthodox Church, the center of it being in Moscow. Now, the Russian Orthodox Church, to this point, has not been a major player in a lot of these things. But with the fall of Alexandria, with the fall of Jerusalem, the retaking of Jerusalem, the fall of Jerusalem, the Crusades, the fall of Antioch, and the taking back of Antioch and the fall of Antioch, back and forth, has been changing hands multiple times in history. Constantinople and Rome, with the fall of these, and then now the fall of Constantinople, and Rome being all the way over there in Italy and concerned only with its own things, especially in the late 1400s. Goodness, the papacy is in a whole uproar of its own. The only center left in the East is Moscow. And chalk this up to something that I got to read for the past month that I had never learned, was how central the Russian Orthodox Church became in the 15 and 1600s. That to me was brand new. I love learning new stuff. but I was just overwhelmed by how much of this was new to me. Um, the Russian Orthodox Church was heading up a lot of the discussion around this idea that the fall of Constantinople was seen as punishment for the capitulation to Rome at the Council of Florence. Now, they would state this outright, and that becomes, I mean, that's kind of painful, but there's a lot in the Orthodox Church that agreed with it. It wasn't just the Russian Orthodox Church. They saw the fall of Constantinople as a judgment of God on a sinful emperor, that would be Constantine the 11th, who made the East to be in league with Rome at the Council of Florence, and by giving so much theological ground to the West. Well, enter in an important ruler in Moscow, and that is Ivan the Great. Ivan the Great, who lives from 1440 to 1505. Yes, born during the Council of Florence. So that's, you can get this time period in your head. Ivan the Great, born 1440, dies in 1505. Ivan the Great, now get this. Here's the connection that's made. He marries the niece of Emperor Constantine the 11th, who again died at the fall of Constantinople. He marries his niece, giving his Russian lineage. Now, again, he's the leader of the Russians in Moscow. It gives his Russian lineage some level of legitimacy to the claim of it continuing Rome. Now, so I want you to see what's going on here. Rome in the fourth century, in the 300s, the capital of the Roman Empire moves from Rome to Constantinople. For 1100 plus years, it stayed in Constantinople until its fall in 1453. Constantinople is taken over by the Islamic Ottoman Empire, and it's gone as far as a Christendom hold, if you will. And the niece of the last emperor marries the ruler of Moscow, and Moscow, the Russian Orthodox Church, being the only center of the church in the East left, at least major center, what would be called an autocephalous church, that center then is being argued as the third Rome. Rome, Constantinople is second Rome, and the Russian Orthodox Church in the early 1500s, late 1400s, names itself the third Rome. In fact, Ivan the Great is the first one to use the term czar, which, if you've seen used before, almost ironically, but sometimes not, unfortunately, but CZAR, if you think about it, is connected to another very similar term from Rome, and that is, it's a Slavic form of the word Caesar. So the idea that Ivan the Great was a czar, yes, connects and makes a direct statement right back to, we're the continuation of Rome. Moscow becomes the center of orthodoxy in the 1500s, and the Russian Orthodox Church gains a significant foothold in kind of the control of the discussion, and almost the way in which a lot of this is going to continue on. It became autocephalous, head to itself, independent, one of the main centers of the church. Now, it doesn't mean that there weren't other centers of the church still operating. There were, but as far as for primacy, or not primacy, excuse me, that's an important word. As far as for significance or prominence, that's the word I'm looking for. Prominence, Moscow becomes the kind of the central focus of a lot of this. Now, if you are, Orthodox Christian living in, the Islamic controlled area of, say, Cyprus or Turkey or something like this, or even Jerusalem, you are going to be looking at the centers of the church kind of vanishing anywhere nearby, and you're going to look at these extremes of the East and the West. They're just getting further and further apart from each other. The West is still in Rome, and the East is now, what, for all practical purposes, centered in Moscow. What are you going to do? And some of them continued to just live quiet lives and continue on. Others began to pursue other ways to deal with this. If the center of the Orthodox Church is going to move to Moscow, which is in the I don't know if you've ever been to Moscow, a little bit cold, a little bit far away. And as we always say, and this is always important to remember, anytime you get anything happen culturally that's going to reform or renovate or challenge the central tenets, it's going to happen on the fringes. And this happens if the center of the movements or of the main structure of a church is going to be in Moscow, you're going to have a real hard time controlling things in Turkey. It's just the way of it. It's so far away, even at a time where still travel is very difficult. And not to mention there's complications in the early 1500s and 1600s that start leading to problems in the West. If you can't think about that, it's Martin Luther, John Calvin, John Knox, and all these other things. The Protestant Reformation starts taking place in the West, and in the East, the center of everything is moving towards Moscow, and so you have a lot of what feel like abandoned Orthodox churches in the East. Now, were they abandoned? No. Did they feel that way? Yes, a lot of them did. And so you will get one of these difficult topics between even to this day, a difficult topic for Orthodox and Roman Catholics to discuss is the existence of what become known as the Eastern Catholic churches, and that is Eastern Orthodox churches that give up on one level or another institutionally on pursuing an Eastern Orthodox head anywhere, and instead come back into league with Rome. And so you will get ones like the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, for instance, where yes, this is a Greek church, it's an Eastern church, but it's Catholic. And so this is kind of one of those um, this is kind of one of those effects that always happens. A lot of the smaller churches that had been a part of the Orthodox Church during the Byzantine Empire began joining back with the Roman Catholic Church after the center of the East moved towards Moscow. And with the Reformation of Europe in the West already well on its way, some would ask, hey, why didn't they just form a Protestant church, right? It's easy as anything now, right? Just like Geneva or Zurich or whatever, you can just do a Protestant church. But that kind of misses a basic understanding of the Orthodox Church. And here's something that for my Protestant brothers and sisters, here's something that I want to remind you of. We don't think of very often. And that is a very important aspect to the Orthodox Church, and that is organizational antiquity. Organizational antiquity. The church that we belong to needs to have its roots in antiquity. This is exceptionally important culturally and theologically. You cannot just argue that all of a sudden we can just up and create a Protestant church. Something Protestantism takes a long time to take root in the East. There are some early whispers of it, and things like this, but as far as everything else is concerned, there's much more bigger fish to fry in the East, let's put it that way, than in the West of things that were going on. Obviously, we've talked a lot about that old history, but let me give the Ukrainian Greek or Catholic Church, excuse me, that we've already discussed a little bit, just as an example of all this. Right, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church is one of these Eastern Orthodox churches. Again, think about the name Ukrainian. It's tied to a culture. Greek, it's Orthodox. It's Eastern. It's not a Latin church. It's a Greek church. Catholic, capital C, in league with Rome church. So Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. It almost sounds like it doesn't follow, but it's one of these Eastern Catholic churches that crop up at this time. It's kind of during the late stages of the Reformation of the West that the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church came into being after a series of negotiations with the Roman Catholic Church that allowed it to keep some of its traditions. Again, all of them can call back to the Council of Florence as kind of laying the groundwork for some of this stuff. So, in some ways and in some places, the legacy of the Council of Florence continued on. But even though the official aspect of it is not connected to that, But it did lay this framework towards when some of these Eastern Orthodox churches become in league with the Roman Catholic Church, they can look back to the Council of Florence and say, "Hey, we at least have a roadmap for how to do this." And so the Roman Catholic Church would allow the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church to keep some of its traditions, but also come under their umbrella, right? And so here's some of the capitulations that Rome look in late 15, early 1600s. Listen to this stuff. You're allowed to use the Slavic language in your liturgy. That's huge, right? I mean, we're talking, post Council of Trent, but this is also before like Vatican II. Today we don't think anything of it, but you're talking about making an exemption, a special exemption from using the Latin Mass back during the Tridentine Catholic period. That's intense. The use of the Slavic language in its liturgy is allowed. Second point, listen to this one. Clergy is allowed to be married. Remember, only in the West did we have celibate priests and bishops, not in the East. The Eastern Orthodox Church never held to that. In fact, they vehemently held against that. And so this would be one of those points that the Roman Catholic Church allowing clergy to be married. Um, the regular oversight and administration of the church affairs will remain in the Greek church's hands. It won't be monitored, nor will it be controlled by Rome. It's only that the Pope is the chief authority. So you realize how different that is from the Council of Florence, too, by the way. Who is giving all the ground? Who is giving up all of the preferences or all of the cultural artifacts? It's Rome that was giving up nearly everything so that the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church could come into existence. That's pretty remarkable. And only the Pope would have the chief authority in the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. Um, so that's just one of them. There was several of them. In fact, I believe over history there's been 22 or 23 that have come actually in full communion with the Roman Catholic Church. This is still again a sore spot between Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches, because this is seen as some of them came to Rome and the majority didn't, and yeah, so that leads to some of these longer names for these churches. But if you ever see like Greek Catholic this or something along those lines, that's kind of what's going on there. Um, when we talk about all these things, I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind more than anything else is that this is not a simple history. And the reason I think a lot of church history classes don't focus on this is not because, well, one is a lot of church history classes take place in the West, where at least in English, obviously, because it's a Western language, but I think a lot of the focus really falls flat as far as these things are concerned because we don't think that they affect us very much, right? I mean, if you're honest with yourself, if you're living in America, for instance, where I am, I'm in New York State, right? The effect that the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church has had on my life is next to zero. But here's where I'm going to put into a challenge for us for the next generation of church history, as we continue to move on into a world that's so interconnected. These things are going to start affecting us, and the issues of that affect the Russian Orthodox Church, or the issues that affect the Greek Orthodox Church, or the issues that affect even Roman Catholicism to a certain extent, and amongst all the Protestant denominations. And we're just getting more and more separations and cultural artifacts and things that as time goes on. But I truly believe that there's a lot more coalescing and coming together in the future than most of us imagine. Now, is that going to be for better or for worse? I think it's gonna be both. As every time we come to something in church history, you try to make this call: is this a good thing or a bad thing? And how many times do I say it's a thing? It can be used for good or bad. Really, time becomes our judge with all of these things. How is it that we can come together when we have so many differences? I don't know. I don't have solutions to that yet. I'm still a member of the old guard, and how the continuing generations will work through some of these issues is something that we're going to all get to learn. But I do hope, and I really hope with all my heart that there's some level of fellowship that we can begin to have so we can work out some of these issues. Um, there's issues that we don't represent each other's sides very well. That happens especially between those who have grown up next to each other. But like Roman Catholics towards Protestants, and in some ways, I feel bad for my Roman Catholic friends. It's really hard to represent what a Protestant thinks because we all disagree with each other. So I imagine looking at us is a very confusing mess. But then, from the Protestant world to the Roman Catholic world, I can say from my own, it's kind of hard to understand because even in the wake of Vatican II, you almost roll in the dice when you come to a Catholic as to what they actually believe. And so making blanket statements on either side is very difficult, and is not always honest or correct. But then you also have now this added reality that we can speak to the other side of the world instantaneously. And so I had a discussion once with a Catholic regarding something, and then all of a sudden someone who's an Orthodox Christian got in on the conversation, and it was interesting. And everyone wanted to pull the discussion in their own direction, myself included, but that conversation can start happening. And I do believe in the coming generations, we're going to see a lot more of that. And who knows? Who knows what comes out of that? Um, once distance no longer affects things, I mean that's going to change stuff because there is no fringe to the empire then. Do people become more tribal at that point? Yeah, I think naturally so. Should Christians? I hope not, but I fear they do. And, it really, I wonder how deep it's going to challenge us. I think it's going to be pretty difficult, and pretty challenging. But I think it's going to be rewarding on levels that we've never seen, too. Um, and difficult on levels that I don't think we've really fully seen in the past. Well, we're not going to cover all the history of Eastern Orthodoxy. We will come back to it again in the future, and talk about the founding of things like the Greek Orthodox Church in the early 1800s, and the fall of the Ottoman Empire at World War One. By the way, the Ottoman Empire contains or continues on until its demise in World War One, but it kind of was eroding for some time before that. After the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire in World War One, several national Orthodox churches arise. We're going to cover all those in a later lecture. With the fall of, well, I mean, so you had the Russian Orthodox Church taking such central aspect, and the Greek Orthodox Church as well. But then when the Bolshevik Revolution came, and 20th century happened, and Russia became Soviet, that affected the Russian Orthodox Church absolutely. And then with the breakup of the Russian Orthodox, or excuse me, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, that created many more Orthodox churches. We'll talk about all that in the future, but I want to kind of give you a little bit of a head notice to that. A lot of the transnational recognition of several of the national Orthodox churches, like Latvian Orthodox and all that kind of stuff, that exists in the world today. It does not happen until after World War One, and some of them not even until the 1990s. So we'll cover all those at a later lecture when we start talking about the late modern church and some of those things. If you have any questions, you can type them in the chat. Other than that, I will pray for us as we close out. And I hope this has been a encouraging and informative aspect of the church's history. Let's pray. Yeah. Our Father, we're grateful. We're grateful to be able to discuss the history of the way that you have been interacting with those who share our faith. We do pray that our fellowship would be closer, that it would only be under the umbrella of Christ, and that what we aim for is your kingdom. And in all the differences that we have, and in all the different directions we desire to pull, we do pray for wisdom, especially in the generations to come, how to weather possibly knitting together or even further tribalism between Christian sects. We do pray for wisdom in the midst of all of that. Use us in any way you would see fit to that end. Father, only for your glory and the praise of your kingdom, we thank you for these things in your Son's name. Amen. All right, there's no questions in the chat. You guys are dismissed. Carry on, and I'll see you next Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. Lord's blessings.